So we were talking about health issues and deaths from different diseases and how they depend on the country level incomes. Of course, within the country there will be many diversities or disparities as well based on income levels. Even rich countries have poor people and so on and so forth. But one thing that's a direct outcome of this living long lifespans being extended is that people are getting older and dependencies are growing, and the biggest thing is then to combine with the fertility rates that we haven't looked at, but we will look at. Fertility rates have been dropping everywhere, including China, India. China may have already reached peak population. They are unable to encourage incentivize the women to have children, even with cash incentives and so on. India hopefully will also reach peak population. There are ideas that population will begin to decrease, in fact, in a couple of decades and so on. So this only raises the population issue in a reverse way. Depopulation, drops in populations, and problems of aging, dependency, labor and so on may become bigger issues. Remember, economists always say that maybe 4 or 5% unemployment rate is very healthy. Sounds crazy, but when you have very low unemployment, then it's very hard to find labor to do many jobs. Norway may be facing that already with unemployment rate of under 3%. They have a hard time finding people to clean the toilets and the streets, for example. And if you're like Japan, which doesn't allow immigrants to come in, then you're going to have serious issues of who to pay and how much can you really pay the Japanese to do the menial jobs and so on. The plight of an aging population is the broader theme. Sweden is not only world champion in collecting statistics, it's also one of the 5 countries in the world with more than 20% of the population being 65 years or older. An aging population is active and contributes to society in more ways than measurable in financial terms. However, getting older changes the accident exposure patterns away from what society generally focuses on and toward the private and invisible. So falling in the house, hitting your head, breaking bones, becoming dependent and so on. In Sweden, more than 4 times as many people die and 7 times more people need health care per year as a result of fall than in a road traffic accident. The total cost of injuries in relation to fall accidents is estimated to a staggering 0.7% of the GDP, and the responsible governmental authority is determined to do something about it. So this is a rich country problem right now, as we'll see in a minute with the map. So here is where 20% or more of the population is 60 years or older in 2015. So today living to 70 or 80 years old is no longer a rarity in many parts of the world, and with nuclearization, more and more of these elderly people are living on their own. Right, so here the numbers 30% or over, 25 to 30%, 20 to 25%. So 20 to 25% of the population is 60 or older in North America, all of Eurasia and Europe, down into Japan, or this is Korea's, and in Japan it's more severe. 30% or over are 60 years or older. Europe has 25 to 30% as well, with many at 20 to 25%. Australia is already at 20 to 25%. The other additional news is that by 2050 this number is going to get drastically worse. So you're going to have 30% or over here, 25 to 30%, 25 to 30%. This is going to get older, much older, and China is aging already. Severe issues with the one-child policy, which has been reversed, and now, as I said, people are just not willing to have children. Numbers not available from India, or at least here, is below 20%. And is expected to remain so in 2050. Demographic projections are always, high uncertainty, so take it with a grain of salt. But nonetheless, this raises issues about where the labor will come from, how the demographic advantage that China and India enjoy now will change over time, and whether Asia will continue to get older and will account for 62.3% of the world's population over 65 years by 2050. And you have Southeast Asian countries here as well, Malaysia and Burma, Thailand, Singapore, and so on, followed by Europe at 12.6% with all these reddish colors. So obviously this is something to consider for planning. And oops, I screwed that up. No empty slide needed there. Let me remove it. Sorry, just now, so that I don't forget. So moving on, there are human-made disasters that are more and more common, of course, now. So you have Deepwater Horizon disaster, which was one of the worst ones you had in the 1980s, 1989. I think the Exxon Valdez, which became a really big disaster of the time, and was related to a drunk pilot of the ship, and a lot of damage done. People forget, but then Deepwater Horizon came and made a massive mess in the Gulf of Mexico, which is still being cleaned up in many ways. Research going on. BP had to pay a lot of money to take care of the damages. The poor are disproportionately exposed to pollution, not only for these sorts of accidents, but just the lifestyles of the countries at any level tend to, there is garbage here, which is it landfill coming, cities export their garbage elsewhere. But many times poor people themselves had to take care of business as well. So sanitation, hygiene, clean water supplies, energy access, fresh water, and so on, safety issues are always a challenge, and poor people are obviously disproportionately exposed to pollution. Here, if you look at the next issue, which is the invasive species, which are also part of the human activities in terms of ship traffic, ballast waters. You have also warming and expansion of range of latitudes for mosquitoes, and global travel and diseases traveling with the pathogens as well, like Lyme disease, chikungunya, and what have you. And this is the number of invasive species in terms of the global distribution. Obviously Greenland has very low number, but still not quite zero. America is dominated potentially because of its vast climate range and all the other commercial and migrational activities. And you have some hotspots here, China and India doing fairly poorly as well. Australia has of course been a hotspot for invasion by mammals much later, by humans much more recently, with elimination of many species, so invasion of invasive species. Invasive species basically are something that have explicit harmful impact on the environment and health of the people, let's say, but what allows them to come in is often related to human activities like clearing out habitats, lawns, deforestation, urbanization, and pollution of the waters, inland and coastal waters, and so on and so forth. If you look at the percentage of species here divided by total number of species, you can see that the percentages are generally higher in some hotspots on the Mediterranean, on the Atlantic, in the ocean here, and in the islands here, and so on. But you can also look at it as threat from invasive species defined as very low to very high threats. And the main message of this article from wildlife.org is that the global south and middle income or lower income countries may be much more vulnerable to threats of invasive species than the richer countries. So you have to go and understand what drivers cause this kind of disproportionate threat. Okay, so this is map of ongoing armed conflicts, number of combat related deaths occurring in the current or past year. This is from 2022. So it doesn't matter, but just to show that there are armed conflicts and skirmishes and mortalities happening all over the world. You have hotspots here in Hamas and Israel right now, the Syrian war and instabilities here into Turkey, Kurds and other issues going into Eastern Europe, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan remain hotspots, Somalia and the region with the impacts of conflicts from here also expand into here. Sudan, I think this is Sudan, which has faced issues which are argued to be related to climate, water resource impacts and so on. Similarly here, potentially climate-driven ethnical conflicts that keep conflicts that never go away, with military being in charge, democracy not functioning well, and so on and so forth. So these are again part of the dynamic system which affect sustainable development. So I should always emphasize that we are looking at all these human systems in the context of barriers and impacts, disturbances, perturbations and disasters that affect sustainable development. Of course, terrorism is a big part of it, and whether this is driven by socioeconomics or religious hatreds or xenophobia or other imagined or real reasons, always is being debated. But the fact is, global connectivity, global information access creates many conflicts, including terrorism, and now it's argued that resource limitations and so on are also causing geopolitical instabilities. Poverty then acts, with some people exploiting the instabilities to create terrorism and so on and so forth. Where do chief economists expect the risk of stagflation? So economic crises are related to various human greed and exploitation of the system, like the mortgage prime, whatever that was called in 2008, that created the massive financial crisis in the US. This is from 2023 January, so you can imagine that the numbers here are not doing so well. So you have to be clear here. Expect weak economic growth, 91% here. Expect high inflation. So there are definitions for economic growth and inflation, but you have some sense about what it means. If your salary is not going up, but food prices are going up disproportionately, and fraction of your salary going to food keeps increasing, or house prices keep jumping out of real ranges, then you have inflation happening. Then governments tend to, or federal fiscal policies tend to raise interest rates and so on to calm down these things and so on. Latin America and the Caribbean, so weak economic growth and inflation. So here high rates of inflation. Europe, Central Asia, basically the entire globe is facing economic growth issues and inflation issues, and stagflation is where economies stagnate, so weakening economic growth and inflation increasing. People keep saying actually inflation is not as bad as it seems, but consumer confidence, another magical economic terminology where people just don't feel good about the future and don't want to spend money. So we are in this trap of having to spend money to keep the economic engine running, and that creates consumption, greenhouse warming, climate change, climate impacts on GDPs, health, productivity, mortality, and so on. So this is one really complicated system. So we'll come back and talk about complexity, but we'll also add corruption. Maybe I'll just add this here. Is transparency.org, which tracks corruption perceptions. So this is the index for 2023. Obviously the scales are there, and you can see that Russia is quite corrupt. Africa tends to be high in corruption, perceived corruption. So does South America and Asia, Southeast Asia in general. Lower here in terms of rich countries here, but obviously socioeconomics, democracy, governance systems and so on affect all these things. What I'll do is I'll come back and add some details on climate change, climate impacts from the IPCC report, since this book made brief references to it, but focused more on the human interactions, human system interactions. So it's worth emphasizing a little bit more the climate change impacts themselves, because those disproportionately affect the poor, and they have direct and indirect consequences on the human dynamics as well, as we are discussing with economies and terrorism and so on, conflicts, etc. Okay, see you in the next podcast.